Hello and welcome to Enchanted Rose Costumes. Today I'm going to be trying the one-day costume challenge, so let's get started. So the pattern I'm going to be trying to make in a day is Folkwear 210, the Armistice blouse. I have not worked with this pattern before, but I have really wanted to add more to my Historybounding wardrobe, and the Edwardian era is a good place to start, I think. So this pattern is available online if you guys want to try this one out for yourself. I'm really looking forward to this, and I hope it turns out well. I have been looking at a bunch of different patterns extant garments online, and from my understanding, the blouse is very straightforward and plain, and then pretty much you make it your own by adding tucks and lace and doing whatever else you want to it. So the actual construction of this should be fairly simple. I've looked over the instructions and I've read it through a couple times to make sure I mostly understand it. But like with all patterns, you don't really fully understand the instructions until you actually have your hands on it. So this is going to be my goal for today. It is 10:22, so I want to complete this before 10:30 tonight. So that is 12 hours of sewing. My husband has our kids out on a hike today, so I have the majority of today to sew, which will be great. Also, today's video is sponsored by June's Journey, and I'll be telling you a little bit more about them later on. So the materials I have, some cotton voile, and then because this is quite thin fabric, like you can see through it quite easily, I'm going to be adding some organza to kind of give it some structure. Just because the voile, I don't want to actually fuse any interfacing to it, so I'm going to be using organza as my, sew-in interfacing. Now, a silk organza would be ideal, but sadly I do not have any silk organza on hand right now. So this is just a plain polyester organza, and hopefully it'll still behave nicely for me. This pattern also comes with information on how to do thread drawing, so if you're working with, like, say a linen or a fabric that you're easily taking the threads out, it'll be much easier to do that if you guys are more interested in having that kind of lace work on your outfits. So I'm just doing a plain lace that I have from my stash, and we'll see how this goes. Okay, so let's get started.
A few days before the challenge, I printed off my PDF copy of the Armistice blouse and began the process of puzzling my pattern together. I quite enjoy the process of putting together PDFs, and this one wasn't too bad at 38 pages. Everyone has a different way of putting their patterns together. I like trimming off all the sides and taping them edge to edge versus overlapping one side, as it's easier to fold up afterwards and put into a larger envelope. After taping together the pieces, I rough cut them out and trace out my size of the pattern. Again, everyone does this differently. Some like to cut out the size and others like to trace it. For me, it's just easier to keep all the sizes so I don't have to reprint in the future. And we are back to the challenge. I personally like cutting out my fabric with a rotary blade as I find it goes much faster. As I mentioned earlier, I am using an organza as my interfacing to add strength to my cuffs, collar, and vestee, while still keeping the sheerness of the voile.
So it is 11 o'clock and everything is cut out. It's all sitting behind me, waiting to be sewn together.
Beginning with the front blouse, I added 2 rows of gathering to the shoulder. Matching up the notches, I gathered the front shoulder to match the back and stroked the gathers with a pin to even them out. After sewing the shoulders, I sewed up the side seams with a French seam. If you don't know what a French seam is, I recommend you check out my video on seam finishes. After pressing the seams of the bodice, I set it aside and began working on the collar. First I pinned the organza to the wrong side of the collar and flatlined them together. After flatlining them, I gave it a press to make sure everything laid smoothly, and then trimmed off any fabric that shifted during the sewing. Next, I pinned my lace to the right side of the voile along the line I just stitched, taking care of the corners to make sure that the lace wouldn't buckle once it was flipped the right way out. I did have to redo the corners once or twice to get it right. Next, I pinned the collar facing to the right side of the collar and stitched everything in place. This was another place that I had to rip out the collar several times as I kept getting the lace caught in the corners. Next, I graded the seam allowance with my applique scissors. Then, turning everything right side out, I gave the collar a good press and began attaching it to the blouse. The next step was adding the facing to the opening of the blouse. The pattern comes with shaped facing pieces, but several pattern reviews suggested using bias cut fabric instead, as it was less fiddly, so that's what I ended up going with. Even with the bias cut facing, it was still a little fiddly, and so I had to rip out a few sections and resew it several times. And after finally getting it right, I graded the seam allowance and pinned the facing in place. Now the instructions say that you can hand sew or machine sew this bit, so I started hand sewing, but then I quickly realized that I wouldn't be able to finish this in a day if I continued, so I ended up top stitching the facing down. Moving on to the vestee, I decided to add a bit of lace and do pin tucks, so first I measured 4.5 inches down from the top and cut along the fabric. Now, because I was adding pin tucks, I also needed to trim down the top bit to make sure it matched the finished width of the vestee. For the inset lace, I centered the lace on the fabric and then pinned it in place and then set it aside for the moment. For the pin tucks, I followed the placement as marked on the pattern. And then matching up the lines, stitch them on the right side of the fabric. I continued pinning and sewing until I'd completed 8 pin tucks. Next, I centered the finished width pattern and trimmed off the excess fabric, and then I set it aside to continue working on the upper portion. First, I stitched down both sides of the lace, and then I carefully cut down the center back and pressed the seam allowance open. Next, using a zigzag stitch, I carefully stitched over the edge of the lace along both sides. And then trimmed away the excess fabric. I then attached the lace to the pin tuck section with a French seam for a clean finish. And finally, with the right sides together, I pinned the organza to the vestee and stitched all the way around to finish the edges, leaving the bottom open so I could turn it right side out.
Okay, so it is 3 o'clock and I am very, very happy with the progress I've made so far. I am going to take a break for lunch, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to let sponsor Marika take over. Thank you, Sewing Marika. Now, as I mentioned earlier, today's video is sponsored by June's Journey. If you haven't heard of June's Journey before, it is a delightful mystery/hidden object game that takes place during the 1920s. As you play the game, you unlock more storylines and challenges with each chapter. So I've been playing this game for probably around 6 months now, and I really like it. There's actually a new addition to the game which I quite enjoy, and that is the Detective's Lounge. The lounge is available for everyone after Chapter 3, Scene 4. So the lounge feature lets you join a group and actually chat with other players that also play the game. There's also a challenge that happens roughly once a week that allows your group to compete against other groups within the June's Journey world, which I find quite enjoyable because I'm quite competitive and I know there's a couple other people in my group who are also quite competitive, and so we always try and get first place. Now there's a very special community event starting June 9th running through to June 12th, and it's both in the game and on the June's Journey Facebook page. And this event is the Mystery Lounge, A Murder Most Foul. During the event, players can share drinks in the lounge to try and meet the drinks served milestone for each day during the challenge. Once that goal is met, all the participants will be rewarded with a daily in-game prize. And over on the June's Journey Facebook page, there will be an exclusive mystery video series with a new video released daily. Also, if by the end of the challenge all the drinks milestones have been met, all players will receive an exclusive decorative item to add to their Orchid Island paradise. June's Journey is free to download on both iOS and Android, and you can use my link down below to try it for yourself. Thank you so much, June's Journey, for sponsoring today's video. Back to you, Sewing Marika.
Thank you, sponsor Marika. After an extended lunch, it was time to start the sleeves. First, I cut the placket opening and then pinned and stitched the placket in place. This step can be done either by hand or by machine, but for the sake of time, I chose once again to use my machine. After finishing both plackets, I stitched up the sleeve seam with French seams. And then I added 2 rows of gathers along the bottom of the cuff and between the notches around the top of the sleeve. Moving on to the cuff, I flatlined the organza to the wrong side of the wall. And then I pinned and stitched the cuff facing in place. Also, little tip, if you want nice corners, try taking a stitch or two at a 90-degree angle instead of stitching right to the corner and then turning. I repeated these steps with the second cuff and then graded the seams and pressed everything nicely. Next, I gathered and pinned the bottom of the sleeve to the cuff and stitched everything in place. I also hemmed the bottom of the blouse while I was at the machine.
So it is 7:30 right now, and I am so close to being finished. All it's really left to do is I need to attach the vestee to the rest of the blouse, and then I have the sleeves to finish. I need to finish sewing up the cuffs and add some buttons, or I think snaps or something. I'm not sure exactly what I'm doing for that yet. And then I also need to sew the sleeves to the blouse and then add the band that goes around the waist that gathers in the back. So, I think I can get it done in the next hour. We shall see.
But first, I quickly tidied my workspace and then got back to work. Using a whip stitch, I quickly finished off the interior of the cuffs. And then I attached the right side of the vestee to the blouse, also using some strong whip stitches. I would like to take a moment to welcome my newest patrons, and a special thanks to Erin Wishart for becoming a patron of the Rose. Next, it was time to add the waist ties. In the instructions, this step was actually at the beginning, but I didn't want to have to deal with the ties the entire time, so I saved them till now. Also, I opted for twill tape ties versus ties made from the voile. I marked out the tie and gather placement, and then I also transferred the placement onto the twill tape. I then stitched 2 rows of gathering stitches along the marked lines, centered my twill tape over the gathers, making sure to line everything up, and stitching the gathers in place along both sides of the tape. After finishing this step, I then moved on to the sleeves. Now, unfortunately, my camera battery died, and so I didn't actually capture any of the footage of me sewing the sleeves. Whoops!
It's done! Okay, so it is 9 o'clock and I'm 99% finished it. I still need to add some snaps down the front just to close this off. And I need to add some snaps at the cuffs. I could add buttons, that's what the pattern calls for, but I'm really not in the mood to do buttons right now. So I am just gonna go with snaps, and I'm going to attach those tonight when I watch a movie with my husband. So I think all in all, I completed the 1-day make challenge, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. I think next time I would probably use a slightly thicker material. I really was just sewing from my stash because that's what I'm doing right now. So all in all, I am happy with it, and I definitely want to try this with a thicker material. So things that I might change for next time when I make this. I'm probably going to make this slightly longer, and I might actually go a size up. This does fit me right now, but I am thinking that I might want something a little bit more loose. It's not that it's tight on me, it's not quite as loose as I had hoped it would be. So definitely going a size up would probably help with that. The sleeve length, I know in a couple of reviews that I read before making up this pattern, there was some complaints about the sleeve length, and this is actually a great sleeve length for me. Maybe it's like a touch long, but for anyone who is shorter than me, definitely recommend checking the sleeve length before you sew it, because yeah, the sleeves, like, they're quite long. All in all though, I'm happy with how it turned out. I think it's really pretty, and I would love to make a shorter sleeve version. Anyways, I hope you have enjoyed today's video. I would love to know your thoughts down below, and if you are going to try out this pattern for yourself. Again, thank you to June's Journey for sponsoring today's video. I definitely recommend you guys check it out, and I will leave the link to that down below. Also, if you are interested in seeing more one-day makes, there is a playlist of a group of us from the CosTube community that have been making them, and so I will link that down below and you can check those out. I really hope you've enjoyed today's video, and I will see you next time. Bye!